Great.
How don't you think that delayed gratification is harder now with technology and Uber Eats and pornography and all types of places that we shouldn't be spending our money? Don't you think it's tougher now than it was, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago?
I got to tell you, I've never heard anybody say Uber Eats and pornography in just like the same exact 5 second span. But yeah, 100%. I mean, look, you say, I thought you were going to say, isn't it harder now than it was, before social media? And of course, the answer is, well, or rather, I would speculate that the answer is yes. But I think you're right that it's even harder now than it was 5, even 7 years ago. And we're that much more connected, and there's benefits to that, of course. And I know you appreciate that. Um, but it also means that there's that many more temptations and that many more options to get distracted. And it requires so much more effort on our part. Sorry.
No, so and it kind of gets into this element. I mean, what you're alluding to, I guess, is friction, right? I mean, this is it. Everything is just so frictionless, right? That
Frictionless, yes.
Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just, it's like we internally, my wife and I were joking because, our credit card got hacked. And so for like a week, we didn't have our credit card, while we were waiting for Chase to send us a new credit card. And it was funny because that meant that every time we needed to make a payment, I didn't have the details saved in my computer. I didn't have it ready. So I had to go to my wallet and I had to get my, debit card out or the other credit card. And it was like, I was just that much more aware of making a purchase or doing anything. That's just one example in the financial space. And it was like, oh, we just introduced a lot more friction into the normal type of thing where I'd say, yeah, I want it. I can just put my thumbprint on my computer and done.
So I mean, you do all this research on future self in a lot of different areas. So it seems like do a lot of people have an unfriendly relationship with their future self? I mean, is it a friendly thing, or is it a kind of an adversarial relationship that a lot of people have between their present and future self?
You know what? I love that question. And I would modify the framing that you had a little bit. So I think of adversarial relationships as ones where you're constantly in battle and, you get annoyed by the other person. I, that's, I think the relationship that a lot of people have with their future self is actually sadder. It's not adversarial per se. It's like just not there. And I like the analogy of uh, like I'm sure you've had a coworker who you never have coffee with them, you never have lunch with them, you're probably not going to get a drink with them unless they're at something with everybody else. It's like they exist. It's not that you're not aware of their existence, you just don't do things for them, spend time with them. You don't, if they're going to call you and be like, Charles, can you help me out this weekend? You'd be like, what? No. And I think that's the sort of relationship, and I'm casting a very wide net here, and this is broad brushstrokes, but I think that's the sort of relationship a lot of people do have with their future selves. And that's not adversarial. That's like almost, it's a form of indifference. It's a form of awareness without really taking care of that other person.
And and obviously, so what are some things that we could do to have to better relationship, or at least focus our attention more on our future self relative to whether it's our spending or whether it's our nutrition and health or whatnot? I mean, is it just a matter of thinking about ourself in the future, or envisioning a better life? What do you see here?
I would love that. I'd love it if just thinking would make it so, but I, I think like any hard problem to solve, that you've got to have multiple solutions, right? And so, yes, I think that part of the solution is shifting focus. And so, you can imagine if we were to draw out that analogy I had a little bit, mentioned a little bit earlier, let's switch it a little bit and, just really talk about our future self as another person. Well, think about a negotiation, think about interacting with a boss or an employee, think about interacting with your spouse, think about interacting with your kid, think about anybody in your life where you're going to have a conversation with them about a decision that's going to affect the two of you, where it's not an obvious choice where everybody benefits, right? um I think the sort of the normal mode of operations is to almost not really focus on the future self, to almost have, what look like negotiations without a partner at the table, almost a silent partner. And so when I say shift the focus, what I mean is let's change that conversation so that you actually start uh, at least thinking about future selves as other people who are going to benefit from or suffer as a result of the choices you make now. So they're at the table with you, right? Um, Now, I mean, if you want to get concrete, right, that's the kind of thinking, and it's a little abstract. And how often can you do that? Well, I do think that, there's two other solutions here. One is introducing friction when you know when when a frictionless outcome would harm the future self, right? um and then also I would say removing friction when that would make for a better outcome, right? So make life easier for your present self if that sort of thing is going to make life better for your future self, right? So sorry, I'll just say the one last thing there. I think of Katie Milkman's work on temptation bundling as a great example of this. you know um Hard to work out right now, but if I pair that workout with the ability to watch the next episode of whatever Ozark, I don't know, whatever I'm watching, that's I'm now reducing some friction and making it more likely that I'll do something positive.
And going back to this idea of introducing friction, and you've done a lot of work in this area. So let's maybe dive into a little bit there. So thinking about even, and I write about in Numb, talking about, that dopamine hit that we get from social media, that maybe if we want to have 20 minutes of our attention focused on our work, we might put the phone in another room and whatnot. But what are some other things that we think about in introducing friction when it comes to some of these elements of instant gratification?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the classic one that you said, like, putting the phone in the other room is a great one, right? But I think, there's other things you can think about, right? Like, what if I make some social contracts too? So I know, like, you know, Charles, I have a goal this week of, I really want to run 10 miles this week. Um, and let's put a little friendly wager on it so that if I fail to do that, you're gonna check in with me. And if I fail to really live up to my promise to you, well, then, I'm gonna have to donate to a charity I don't want to donate to, or I'm gonna have to give you some money, or what you could imagine. There's different sort of variations of this. I had a student who told me that he and his brother made $1,000 bet about working out. Um, and that's pretty costly mess up there, but that's like a different type of friction. It's a little harder to implement. But it's sort of gamifying things a little bit more, I would say.
And Hal and I are friends, and that's what happened. Hal didn't meet one of his goals. And so the deal was he had to be a guest on the Numb podcast if he did meet the goal. So Hal failing at his goal is my benefit as well as to the listeners.
And here I am.
Here you are. So I'm going to try out a theory. You could tell me I'm full of it or not. So
Yeah.
People who have concrete goals, whether they're short or long term, I'm painting with a broad brush, are more susceptible to instant gratification than those that do not have, or I'm sorry, opposite of that. Let's try that again. People who have concrete goals are less susceptible to instant gratification than those who have not articulated any type of future self whether it's any of these categories we've talked about or whatnot. How does goals play into that? Is it the number one element here?
I think it's a great question. I think as a theory, I think it's a really reasonable one. Um, you know, I, like from a research standpoint, right? I'm trying to think about whether anybody's looked at this specific question, right? Because I want to be careful to say, well, we know this. We don't actually know that. And I think that's what makes it a great question. And I could easily imagine a scenario where that's true, right? It's harder to get off of your path. It's harder to get sort of distracted or um, you know, uh, go wayward and succumb to instant gratification if there are goals slash, like guardrails in place, right?
Yep.
And you know, now nonetheless, there's always a balance, right? You don't want to have some life in which like there's no room for spontaneity. Um, but if I know for certain that I have a goal of, saving a certain amount of money or working out a certain amount or, uh, whatever the goal may be, then when temptations arise that are in direct conflict with that, it may be easy to see how the conflict is there and to say no. But
Right.
if there's nothing sort of concrete that I'm making a comparison to, then it may be really easy to succumb to that sort of temptation, because why not?
Yeah. I mean, it seems like so I'm a runner, and there's a really great bakery really close to me. And when I think about getting cookies in there, I think about how I'm going to face that scale in the morning. That is like I have to answer to that scale. And I just wonder, without that scale, it's now, I'm spending willy-nilly, right? There's really not necessarily any type of justice for my eating these wonderful cookies, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. You'll this is related. I think one of my colleagues and I were at lunch. This is pre-COVID. We were sitting outside, we're eating, and took a he sort of stepped back and took a picture of his food. Now, this is not one of these colleagues who's like, Instagramming his beautiful food. And this also wasn't a meal where that would be the case. This was like at the school cafeteria at UCLA. And I said, "Hey man, what are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm working with a nutritionist right now. And she has me sending pictures of everything I eat, and then she can do a rough calorie count. And it, partly helps him answer to her." And well, the funniest part about this, I noticed, well, dude, you've got the plate there, you're taking the picture, but what's the candy bar on your leg underneath the table? And he said, you caught me. And he said, he said, "I talked about that with her, and she said, well, you can send me all the pictures, but and you can lie to me, but you can't lie to yourself, and you can't lie to your
Mhm.
waist. You can't lie to the scale. There's something there that's going to be, you'll be accountable to."
Yeah, that people lie on social media. People lie when they're taking pictures of their food to their
Right.
nutritionists or their trainers.
Right.
That's right.
Right. Yeah.
Locus of control, and we talk about scarcity. So whether it's elements of people that are living in poverty and whatnot, and that kind of that scarcity mindset and whatnot, um, plays a role in individuals when it comes to maybe being a little bit more susceptible that, I guess maybe kind of an ingrained behavior of instant gratification relative to any of these categories. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with you?
Oh, that's interesting. I have to tell you, I probably know less about that type of work than there's a lot of other people. You know, I can tell you, you should talk to Kelly Goldsmith of Vanderbilt. She's like one of the world's experts in scarcity, and she really knows about that stuff. So I'm like, I think I just don't know quite enough to speculate there. But it's a good question, and you can imagine how. I mean, let's take it another direction, which is to say, your circumstances can impact your ability to handle these sorts of temptations uh and an ability to delay gratification. Circumstances as simple as um having a hard day, being frustrated already, may make it easier to succumb. Right now, I know there's a lot of research on willpower as a muscle, and there's a lot of controversy around that work. And I think there's some kernels there, but also it may not be as widespread as we think maybe. But um So yeah, I don't have a great answer for you there other than to say we are not stable, individuals, and there's always circumstances that are affecting our ability to withhold, and delay gratification.
And of course, I gave you a list of questions, and that was not one of them for our listeners out there. So this is kind of how it goes with the
Oh,
Numb
yeah, yeah, no, I
Podcast,
forgot. All right, Charles, do you think I prepared for this and read those questions?
Fair enough. So people are listening to this or they're watching it and they're thinking, my life has become instant gratification through all the different means of technology and whatnot. Getting out of the whole willpower is a muscle element of this, but are there intermediate steps that folks could do, whether it's kind of shifting their focus to their future self? I mean, what's kind of a first step in general and kind of beginning that process of delaying gratification on things that are important to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think let me make, like, if I were to say, like, here's a menu of steps and let me give you one, one of them I would say is, if you know that you have a stable, let's just take the saving space for a second, the financial space, you know, I would say if it's possible to set up an automatic savings account, do it. Now, but only do that if are relatively certain that you'll have some surplus at the end of the month, because the last thing you want to do is have an automatic savings account that causes you to go into overdraft. So everyone's circumstances are different, right? If you're grappling with debt, the first, don't save right now. First thing is, let's get out of that debt and then move on to saving. If you're fortunate enough to not have to worry about that as much, then do something that removes some of the friction and makes life easier for your future self by making saving automatic. And then, maybe I should have said this even before that. Take a minute to actually have a so-called conversation with your future self to figure out what's important to him or her. What do you want that life, your future self's life to look like? Um, you know, let's not just talk about, like, oh, let's eat healthier and save more, but why? You know, because I think along the way you might say, actually, I want to do some more stuff now. I want to enjoy what I have right now, and create some balance between now and later.
So that's kind of going from abstract to concrete in
Yeah.
terms of what that goal is. There before you go on, is there a time window? I mean, I would think that if people started thinking about, well, I want to be healthy in like 10 years, like if they shifted their focus way out, that could actually be harmful to them. I mean, I know it's not hard and fast, but are there realistic windows when it comes to thinking about saving or whatnot that folks can achieve when they're starting this?
Yeah, I think, I think it's always a little easier to scaffold up, than to start big and move back, right? And so I think, let's start with a year or two and go from there. And there's nothing that stops this exercise from saying, let's start from a year or two and then move to 5 years and then 10. I think it could be really hard to start with 30 or 15 years out. Because I mean, especially now, I know we're recording this in the midst of the Delta variants rise, and who knows what life will be like when this gets posted. But it's hard to think about what you're going to be doing in 6 weeks right now, let alone well, actually, ironically, maybe it's easier to think about what life will be like in 2 years, because you just hope it's going to be the way it used to be in some ways, right? But yeah, I mean, I would start sort of scaffolding. I think that's a great I think you sort of indirectly raised that idea, and I think it's a great one.
And there seems like an element too of, I mean, as you're starting this process, we go back to these people who are kind of thinking about, okay, I need to start thinking about my future self maybe for the first time, and whether they're, they could be older folks, younger folks, successful or whatnot. But there's also an element of maybe being kind to yourself. Like you kind of alluded to this idea of people being kind of over disciplined, like they just go from 0 to 100 miles an hour. And it seems like you also, even when you're, and correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth that are incorrect, but that when you're focusing on your future self, maybe for the first time, you also need to be kinder to your present self as well when you might stumble. Is that fair?
That's definitely fair. I mean, I think the idea of having some compassion for your different selves, and that can also mean, by the way, not to get too trippy about it, but let's say that you have some ultimate future self, a self in 5 years or 10 years, or maybe even really further out. There's other future selves along the way who might screw things up, and I think we need to be compassionate to those selves too, and compassionate to ourselves today. It's like, and like, now the problem becomes when all we have is compassion for our immediate selves, and that licenses us to constantly overspend and overeat and over procrastinate or whatever it is, and then there's no room left to do anything for our future self. But I think, to your point, shifting all the way, 0 to 100, you get, what are you going to be left with?
Right.
So I think it's worth appreciating compassion along the way and balance.
You mentioned kind of social contracts earlier on, and one of the episodes that we did a few weeks ago was on this notion of loneliness and this element of isolation that is just not even just with COVID, but even before COVID, right?
Yeah,
Just people
yeah.
are feeling really isolated. So folks that are listening to this that might be a little bit more isolated, what kind of things can they do when it comes to kind of having those social contracts? I mean, is it using social media and other platforms, or is it just maybe recognizing goals within yourself and answering just to your future self? But what about folks that are a little more isolated?
It's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I would think that social media, um, and so let's like like expand that a little bit, to other sort of online forums and communities, right?
Yeah.
So whether it's on Reddit or Facebook or wherever it may be, I mean, this may be a space where some of these social media giants can really do some good by causing, by allowing people to form some connections, especially in these spaces where you might see somebody desiring a social contract, but having a hard time, if they're isolated, like you said, to try to execute on it, right? So
Yeah. I mean, I would think that if I'm trying to lose weight, and let's say, and I write about in the book that, there are a lot of benefits to these platforms like Facebook, that especially if you are connected, if your friend list of friends are people that you actually know, right? That they're family that are geographically far away, you're close to them and you're using that to share
right.
elements. That's a good thing. And so it would seem to me that if you're trying to, let's say that you're trying to lose a lot of weight and you're really trying to take elements of your health back, there could be real power in maybe having that smaller group kind of track your journey and taking control of your health, and whether it's pictures or whatnot, but you're actually creating maybe an informal social contract with that group. Even though you're isolated, there could be opportunities to say, okay, I am going to think about my future self because I'm going to be posting a new picture of myself in a month, and everyone's going to be looking to see how I'm doing, and that's going to help me delay gratification. Does that make sense?
Yeah, by the way, you said new picture and not nude picture. I just
That
want
is
to
correct.
clarify.
I did.
I just want to clarify that. Yeah, it does make sense, and I think it kind of highlights the difference between physical and geographic isolation and social isolation, writ large, right? And yes, that makes sense to me, providing that you're willing to feel vulnerable with that small group of people, whether that's family or friends you haven't seen in a long time. That I do think that could be a very powerful tool in the arsenal, to be fighting the these temptations and sort of trying to promote delay of gratification.
Last question. I'll get you out of here on this one. So I would sense that there's also a lot of people who think, you know what, the temptation's just all around me. I'm not going to be able to alter my environment to make it, to add
Yeah,
friction, to address some of these things that my phone's with me, or bad
right.
food or whatnot. What do you say to those folks when it comes to kind of taking that first step to kind of controlling their environment, maybe for the first time?
I would say don't don't try to think about the whole big picture. Try to think about the littlest, smallest thing you could do. And I would say, don't make it, I'm going to take email, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram off my phone. No, no, no. Like, let's start small. Maybe how about for 2 hours of the day? How about for an hour of the day, you keep your phone, in the closet or whatever it is. Okay, so dinner time, phone goes in the bedroom. So something that's manageable. It's just an hour, just 30 minutes, whatever. Okay, an hour you can't do, let's do 30 minutes. And let's just start small. Let's try to do that for 3 or 4 days in a row. And then gradually bump it up. But if I say quit cold turkey, it's not going to work,
Yeah.
Um,
Hal Hershfield, my friend, is professor of marketing, behavioral decision-making, and psychology at UCLA's Anderson School of Management, and he holds the UCLA Anderson Board of Advisors term chair in management. Hal, thanks for joining me, my friend.
Thank you, Charles. My pleasure.